The year is 1777, and the snow that fell that winter was not white. It was red. The road to Valley Forge was slick with ice and mud, and it stained the steps of the soldiers barefoot crimson. The war was bleeding, and so were the patriots. But there was nowhere to go. Retreating south would mean entering a winter encampment among disease and death in Philadelphia. So the army marched west towards Valley Forge, a location chosen more by accident than design. It was here, said the officers, where they could rest and gather supplies. The men trudged on, though they had no idea how bleak their situation truly was. George Washington rode in front, hiding his face behind his tall black hat. He, too, hoped that Valley Forge would provide some reprieve, some chance to regroup and heal. But he also knew the truth. Valley Forge would not be a respite. It would be a test. Would his ragtag band of rebels be able to endure the coming winter? Or would they disintegrate into starving, freezing heaps? It was hard to tell. Now Washington, normally so steady and resolute, felt fear gnawing at his confidence. For 3 days, the army struggled through the winter wilderness. Finally, as dusk approached on December, they arrived at the fork in the road leading to the forge. The sight before them offered little comfort. A dense, dark wood lay to one side, offering little protection from the elements. Across the icy stream, a clearing stretched barren and empty under the leaden sky. 2 fires smoldered in its center, sending up thin tendrils of smoke like ghosts. And everywhere lay snow, deep, untouched snow. It was worse than Washington had feared, but retreat was impossible. The nearby woods could offer some cover from the elements, and the men needed that. But the clearing was their only hope for food and supplies that might not exist. Officers gathered around a tattered map, trying to orient themselves to the landscape. Where were the supplies? Where were the roads? Where were the rivers? Washington looked down at his men. Their faces, gaunt and gray, were streaked with dirt and ice. Their clothes hung in rags from their emaciated bodies. Most carried no weapons except their muskets. All were barefoot. What was their chance of survival? Washington wanted to speak to his men, to tell them that they would be cared for, that this ordeal, too, would pass. But the words died in his throat. How could he lie to them? He, too, was afraid. He urged the men forward to the clearing, hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. As the first rays of dawn touched the treetops, the soldiers began to trickle into the clearing. Many collapsed from exhaustion, and the officers helped them to fires already crackling with resin and pine. Others stared into the flames, pulling their tattered blankets tight around them, seeking warmth that was never there. Still others wandered aimlessly, calling out for food or water or medicine. All were hungry, all were sick, all dreamed of home. A few figures moved among the men, trying to rouse them, organize them, make them useful. These were the officers, men like John Armstrong, Alexander Hamilton, Nathaniel Greene, and Baron von Steuben. They struggled to maintain order, to make sure that no one froze or starved, that someone stood guard while others searched for food. The men began to disperse, collecting firewood, foraging for berries, hunting small game, searching for roots and herbs, anything to fill their empty stomachs or warm their chilled bones. By evening, the clearing teemed with activity. Fires crackled, men shouted. Muskets cracked as soldiers managed to hunt down a deer. But even the kill couldn't hide the glum reality of their situation. The army was alive, but it was starving. And as the deer sizzled over the fire, a new arrival cut across the clearing, striding purposefully toward George Washington. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a fine green coat and buckled shoes. He tipped his tricorn hat to Washington and introduced himself as Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Washington returned the greeting and then watched as the Baron strode confidently toward the shivering mass of soldiers. He would come to know him as the man who saved Valley Forge. Von Steuben had served in the Prussian army, and his military bearing and knowledge were immediately apparent. He set about organizing Washington's troops, drilling them into shape, teaching them how to handle their weapons. March in formation, camp for the night, cook their meals. He taught them how to fight. Though harsh and demanding, he also treated the men with respect, speaking to them kindly and often sharing his own meager rations. Under his guidance, the men became more than soldiers. They became an army. In the meantime, Washington met with his officers, desperately trying to chart a path forward. Food and supplies were critically low. The men needed not just training, they needed doctors, tents, blankets, shoes, everything, and time was running out. The winter solstice had passed, and the days were lengthening. Spring would arrive soon, and with it, the British would march again. He needed help, and he knew just where to find it. As days grew longer and colder, George Washington prepared to leave his post. Winter had settled over Valley Forge, and the Continental Army was still in desperate straits. The officers were losing faith. They argued constantly, blaming each other for dwindling supplies, complaining that they were not paid, that they were ignored, that they were no better than militia. But Washington refused to buckle. With von Steuben's help, he brought order to the camp, and without that order, there would be no army. And without that army, there would be no United States. He left a stiff note with his officers and then rode toward Philadelphia. There he hoped to meet with Thomas Jefferson and convince the Continental Congress to fund his army. Washington needed money. He needed food, he needed medicine, but most of all, he needed hope. Without that, his men would freeze or starve before spring. Days later, he received a letter from Thomas Jefferson. It held the promise of aid, but it also delivered a sobering message. The war was unpopular. France and Spain were watching to see if the colonies could hold out through the winter. If they could, there was a chance the rebels might win. But if they failed, the European powers would side with Britain and America, as chance for independence would evaporate like mist in the morning sun. And so, while Jefferson promised aid, he could not promise much more than that. There was little money in the colonial treasury, and what there was went mostly to pay the salaries of government officials. Sending supplies to Valley Forge seemed like a low priority. As Jefferson wrote, "The general government is not in a situation to give supplies on the large scale you propose. Nor is there an individual in America who could." It was a crushing blow, but it spurred him to action. He rode back to Valley Forge, determined to do whatever it took to save his army. He found his men in better shape than when he left them, but still in dire straits. While von Steuben drilled them into shape, other officers organized supply runs, hunting parties, medical clinics. Captain John Marchant, for example, established a bakery near the river, turning flour and water into bread, and the soldiers' empty stomachs into full bellies. Dr. William Shippen ran a medical tent, treating the wounded, the sick, the exhausted. His skills and compassion kept hundreds of men from dying. And Major Thomas Weems scoured the countryside, buying or stealing food, clothing, livestock. His daring raids provided much-needed relief. And yet, as spring approached, the army remained on the brink. If it hadn't been for one final and probable infusion of aid, they likely would have perished. For weeks, Washington waited anxiously for word from Congress. Then, on February 25, 1778, a rider arrived bearing a message from Philadelphia. Congress would vote on funding the army the following week. Funds would arrive soon. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The supplies began arriving in dribs and drabs, then in growing numbers. Food, clothing, tools, medicines. Barrels, boxes, and bales piled up beside the river, evidence of the support that had almost failed to materialize. But it was real, and that was all that mattered. Throughout the long months of winter, the men at Valley Forge had dwindled in number. Starvation and disease had claimed hundreds of lives, and those who lived were far from whole. The soldiers suffered from infected wounds, dysentery, pneumonia, typhoid fever, and a mysterious ailment known only as the flux. Some recovered, others did not. By the time spring arrived, nearly half of Washington's army was dead or disabled. But that spring, something remarkable happened. The Continental Army emerged from its long encampment, fit and ready to fight. The men were still barefoot, still ragged, still hungry. But they were organized, trained, hopeful. They carried with them a new banner, a new flag, a new resolve. They were ready to win a war. And in that moment, George Washington knew that the Revolution would not die. To learn more about the American Revolution, visit our website for additional resources. Click the link in the description below. This is the third episode in our series about George Washington. To watch the next episode in the series, click the link above or follow the link in the description. And thanks for watching. In December of 1777, George Washington's ragtag army of some 2,000 troops left their camp near Wilmington, Delaware, and started their march northwest towards the town of Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The thermometer hovered around zero. The wind whipped off the Delaware River and bit at every exposed piece of skin, and a fresh snowfall crunched underfoot. The soldiers struggled on, many barefoot and wearing little more than threadbare jackets. Some stumbled from exhaustion. Others fell victim to the biting cold. And before the end of the day, all knew what lay ahead would be a test of endurance unlike any they'd faced before. To understand why George Washington's army staggered through the snow toward Valley Forge, we must turn back the clock to the beginning of 1777. A year that had promised victory, yet delivered disaster. The previous winter had ended in triumph. Washington's daring crossing of the icy Delaware River and his victories at Trenton and Princeton had shocked the British and electrified the colonies. Patriots celebrated in taverns and farmhouses, believing the tide had finally turned. But war is never a straight road. The victories of early 1777 would prove a high peak followed by a steep and rocky descent. In London, British commanders crafted a plan to crush the rebellion by cutting the colonies in two. The idea was simple: seize control of New York and the Hudson River Valley, isolating New England, the heart of the Revolution, from the southern colonies. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada. General William Howe, already in New York, would move north up the Hudson. Their forces would meet, divide the rebels, and strangle the uprising. But Howe had other ideas. Instead of marching north, he set his sights on Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital, home of the Continental Congress and a symbol of resistance. Washington tried to guess Howe's intentions, but the British general moved with cunning and speed. In August, Howe's fleet landed at Head of Elk, Maryland, and began marching toward Philadelphia. Washington moved to block him. The clash came at Brandywine Creek on September 11, 1777, under a blistering sun. The two armies fought a brutal day-long battle. Washington's men fought hard, but Howe's larger, better-trained force flanked them, forcing a retreat. The road to Philadelphia lay open. 11 days later, the British marched into the city without firing another shot. The Continental Congress fled to York, Pennsylvania. For many, it felt like the revolution was unraveling. Washington, unwilling to surrender the initiative, struck back in October at Germantown. His plan was bold, perhaps too bold. In a thick morning fog, American columns lost their way, firing on one another in confusion. The attack collapsed, leaving hundreds dead or captured. By late November, Washington's army was battered and weary. Supplies were low, enlistments were ending, and disease was spreading. British forces were comfortably quartered in Philadelphia, well-fed and warm, while the Americans were scattered in the cold Pennsylvania countryside, with winter closing in. Washington faced an impossible choice: stay in the field, harassing the British and risking the complete destruction of his army, or find a winter encampment where they could regroup, if they survived the months ahead. He chose Valley Forge, just 18 miles from British-held Philadelphia. Close enough to watch the enemy, far enough to avoid sudden attack. It was a decision that would test the very soul of the Revolution. What lay ahead was not a battle against the British, but a battle against hunger, cold, and despair itself. The march to Valley Forge lasted 5 days. and by the time the soldiers reached their destination, they were mere skeletons of their former selves. Nearly 2,000 men had deserted the army since August. Those who remained stumbled into camp and collapsed. Without a moment's rest, they quickly distributed what little food they had brought along, then melted away into the forest to scavenge whatever they could. But there wasn't much to be found. The area hadn't been settled for years, and game was scarce. Men returned to camp, hungry and angry. If things didn't change fast, Washington risked losing his army, not to the British, but to starvation. As officers met in a nearby tavern to discuss their options, Washington rode out to inspect the camps. He found thousands of men huddled around small fires, too weak to keep themselves warm. The sight shook him to his core. Though he'd grown up privileged and powerful, owning more than 300 slaves himself, he'd never known real want. But here before him were men who looked ready to claw at his own throat to survive. At least they had some shelter, if the word can be used loosely. Across the sprawling encampment, men slept in caves, dug into hillsides, beneath trees, or whatever scant cover they could find. Women and children huddled with their families, sharing meager meals of boiled roots and berries. Some men sat listlessly by the fire, nursing painful wounds or missing limbs. Others shuffled about, half mad with cold and hunger. Everywhere Washington looked, he saw suffering. It was nothing like anything he'd seen in the war. No battle, no defeat. Here was something far worse. He returned to the officers' meeting and demanded action. There was only one solution: forage for food among the local farms. But it was November, almost the end of the harvest season. Farmers had stored their crops away for the winter. Any food remaining would be gone in weeks. Yet there was no choice. Washington ordered Colonel Elias Boudinot to lead his quartermaster general, a regiment of New Hampshire men tasked with gathering supplies. But they couldn't find enough food to feed the army for even one day. Desperation grew in Valley Forge. Washington paced his quarters, running his fingers through his already thinning hair. Sleep seemed impossible. When he did close his eyes, he saw the hollow cheeks of starving children, the gaunt faces of veterans, the ghosts of those who died in the night. Even the officers shared in the misery, eating no better than common privates. One wrote home that the army was in a most distressing situation for want of provisions. Another watched his health fade. "I have not slept well nor eaten heartily," he confided in his journal, "and my strength seems to be returning to the ribs." All around him, men grew weaker by the hour, their bodies ravaged by cold and hunger. They needed help, and fast, because death stalked the frozen encampment, taking the strongest and the weakest alike. When Washington heard the pleas of a captain, Thomas Proctor, he knew he'd have to take drastic action. Proctor's words echoed those he'd heard so often. He spoke of men too weak to stand guard duty, of families reduced to eating squirrels and cats. "The soldiers are dying," he told the general, "and those that are not will shortly be disabled from the service. Unless they could be fed, they wouldn't last long." And so Washington turned to an unlikely savior. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a retired Prussian military officer, had come to America in 1777 with a single goal: help win the war. Tall and imposing, with a booming voice and bearing the scars of numerous battles, he commanded respect wherever he went. Yet his knowledge of military tactics was the only reason he was allowed near Washington's headquarters. Steuben didn't know a thing about wilderness survival or farming. Nevertheless, the general put him in charge of feeding his army. On December, Steuben marched into a nearby village and announced he was taking over its farms. He deployed soldiers to gather livestock and plant a kitchen garden, while others scoured barns and silos for food. Then he divided the bounty among the regiments, giving each the rations they desperately needed. Men looked up from their fires, mouths agape, as soldiers marched through the camp carrying baskets overflowing with corn, carrots, potatoes, apples, and bread. That night, fewer men died in the cold, their empty stomachs replaced with full bellies. And yet, despite Steuben's best efforts, Valley Forge would become a place of hardship and despair, a place where men and women suffered greatly, a place where they'd pushed past the breaking point. But from these ashes would rise hope, courage, unity, sacrifice, leadership, faith, and love, which inspired them to persevere through Valley Forge, win the war, and forge a new nation. This has been a Wondrium video. This is the story of Valley Forge. It's me. Welcome to my channel. December 19th, 1777. The date would be etched into the memories of those who lived to see spring. On that morning, the Continental Army began its march toward Valley Forge. It was not a grand procession of banners and drums. There was no cheering, no triumphant songs. This was a march of necessity, not victory. The soldiers moved slowly along the winding country roads, their muskets slung loosely over their shoulders, their eyes fixed on the muddy, frozen ground. Snow clung to their hair and beards. For many, every step was agony. The soles of their feet cracked and raw from marching without shoes. Some wrapped strips of cloth or old rags around their feet, but these quickly soaked through with snowmelt, offering little protection. A young soldier from Connecticut wrote in his journal, "We march without bread, with no meat, and some without clothing. Blood stains the snow at every step." The wagons that rattled alongside the column were nearly empty. There were no barrels of flour, no sacks of grain. What they carried were the sick and the wounded, men too weak to walk, their faces pale and sunken, wrapped in thin blankets against the cold. Washington rode near the front, his face stern but unreadable. Inside, however, his thoughts churned. The commander-in-chief knew the Army's condition better than anyone. He had written letter after letter to Congress, begging for supplies, pleading for shoes, blankets, and food. The responses came too slowly, when they came at all. In one letter to the Continental Congress, written just days before the march, Washington had warned, "We have, this day, no less than 2,873 men in camp unfit for duty, because they are barefoot and otherwise naked." And yet, here they were, marching deeper into the Pennsylvania winter. By late afternoon, the first soldiers crested the low ridge overlooking the Schuylkill River. Before them lay a wide plateau of open fields, flanked by thick woods. To the men, it looked bleak and empty, just frozen ground and skeletal trees. To Washington, it was both a refuge and a risk. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the icy grass, and studied the land. Valley Forge had several advantages. It was close enough to Philadelphia to monitor British movements. The surrounding high ground could be fortified against attack. The nearby forest offered timber for building shelters, but there was no food here, no ready supply of clothing, and no comfort. Survival would depend on the men's ability to endure and to build. As darkness fell, the soldiers began to scatter through the fields and woods, gathering branches and logs. Fires were lit, their smoke curling upward into the black winter sky. Men huddled close to the flames, their hands extended to catch whatever warmth they could. That first night in Valley Forge, there were no huts, no tents for most, only the open air. Many slept on the frozen ground, their muskets beside them. The wind carried the muffled sound of coughing and the occasional groan of pain. Somewhere in the dark, Washington stood alone, looking over the camp. Behind him, the Revolution was bleeding. Ahead, the future of America teetered on the edge of collapse. The march was over. The fight to survive had just begun. The next morning, the soldiers awoke to find the ground hard-packed with ice. The fires burned out. Cold seeped through men's worn clothing and settled deep into their bones. Their situation worse than ever. More snow fell that night, blanketing the valley in white. Each step was harder now, each breath more difficult. With no training in carpentry, no experience in building in such extreme weather, the men hacked away at logs with axes and saws, wrestled fallen trees onto their sides, fashioned planks into roof supports. They struggled to create shelter, but progress was slow and frustrating. One young soldier, Jedediah Huntington, sat on an upturned bucket, whittling a piece of wood as he watched others work. He was angry. Angry at the British, angry at the war, and most of all, angry at himself. He wasn't strong enough, smart enough, skilled enough to really help the others. He felt like a useless boy playing with sticks while his country froze to death. He tossed the sliver of wood aside and rose to his feet. His gaze swept over the camp. He saw fellow soldiers, strong and capable men, driven to tears by the bitter cold. He saw fear in their eyes, the kind of fear that crushed hope and sapped the will to live. He wouldn't stand by and watch. He might not have much, but he did have his skills with wood. Taking up his tools again, he joined the others. At least here, in the relative safety of the forge, they had something to do, some way to channel the energy that raged inside them. Turned into weeks, weeks into months. The men built nearly 2,000 huts, or as close to huts as they could get, covered with a layer of thatch to keep out the worst of the winter winds. The roofs leaked, the floor sagged, but they were a shield against the freezing temperatures. Most importantly, they kept the men out of the open, away from the biting wind that stole body heat and froze skin and lungs. Though there was still sickness, men dying from cold exposure and starvation, the death rate slowed. Within the huts, men huddled together for warmth. Some shared blankets, others wrapped themselves in coats made of many layers. Patched and repatched until the fabric was almost threadbare. Food was scarce, though, and men grew weaker with each passing day. In January, Washington ordered his starving troops to kill any animal they could find: rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even snakes. Anything that moved was fair game. If a soldier caught fish in the river or pulled a bird out of the sky, everyone around him ate. In February, Congress finally sent help: barrels of flour, bales of blankets, and most crucial of all, shoes. Unfortunately, those supplies were meant for the Southern Army, and since travel between the North and South was impossible during the winter, the soldiers at Valley Forge never got them. Supplies continued to trickle in throughout the rest of the year, but nothing in large enough quantities to really make a difference. So the soldiers continued to forage for food, hunt for animals, and live on the edge of starvation. It was a brutal existence, but they endured. By spring, the ice had melted, the snow had vanished, the huts were torn down, the barracks erected. The men were dirty and lice-ridden, but they were alive. They trained with new recruits and prepared to march. When the order came to move out, they left Valley Forge behind and headed toward New York, where they would finally get their revenge on the British. At least that's how the history books tell it. Of course, the real story of Valley Forge isn't about George Washington or the Continental Army. It's about the people who lived in the area around Valley Forge and how they dealt with the influx of tens of thousands of men who needed food and medical care. It's about the profiteers who sold the army everything it did and already have, and the politicians who refused to help unless they could profit from it. Most of all, it's about the soldiers who didn't make it out of the valley alive. When the army arrived, the local residents knew it was in bad shape. They also knew they needed the soldiers as much as the soldiers needed them. There was no food, clothing, or medical care available in the area. And if the British took control of the region, things would become much worse. So they welcomed the soldiers and helped however they could. Farmers gave their livestock to be slaughtered, creating massive piles of meat for the men to eat. They donated what grains they had left from the harvest and whatever vegetables they could grow in the short time between seasons. Shopkeepers offered what goods they had for sale, mostly at inflated prices, but they also provided needed services: mending clothing, repairing shoes, treating wounds. These people weren't saints. They simply understood that helping the Continental Army was in their best interest. Others, like John Hanson and Thomas Dongan, realized there was money to be made. Hanson, a Maryland merchant, purchased supplies from Congress and sold them to the army at steep prices. He charged exorbitant rates for everything from basic foodstuffs to nails and window glass. Dungin, a Pennsylvania shopkeeper, sold alcohol to the soldiers, who often paid him in promises rather than cash. He hoped that once the army was properly supplied and compensated, he'd get his money. However, neither man saw the revolution through. Both were killed in the war, Hansen by a stray cannonball in 1778, and Dongan in the Newport, Rhode Island raid of 1778. There were plenty of others who made money off the war, like Thomas Mifflin, a Pennsylvania delegate to the Continental Congress. In January of 1778, Mifflin wrote to John Hancock, complaining that Congress hadn't paid him for his expenses in over 2 years. But he wasn't just saying that so Congress would pay him. It was true. Mifflin was broke and desperately needed funds to continue his work. And he had a solution. He proposed establishing a fund that members of Congress could borrow money from. Members would pay 6% interest on their loans and be expected to repay them within 3 years. Or they could wait until the state they represented had outstanding debts to Congress. Then they would be deducted from the amount owed by that state. Other delegates liked the idea, and it went into effect on July 12, 1778. Suddenly, Mifflin had hundreds of dollars, then thousands. Within 2 years, he owed Congress £4,600, more than any other member. He wasn't alone. The war created a lot of wealth for a lot of people. And wherever there's wealth, there's greed. For more stories about the hidden side of history, stay tuned. Winter had come to Valley Forge, and with it, death. It arrived not just in falling snow, but silently, steadily sapping the strength of Washington's ragged army, bringing down even the sturdiest of his soldiers with a racking cough or a fever that burned away their will to live. In retrospect, the cold was not the worst enemy Washington's troops faced that winter. Hunger was within days of their arrival at Valley Forge. The desperation in the camp became impossible to ignore. Soldiers who had marched from the city were soon riding home, begging to be relieved of duty, because they simply had no strength left to fight. Congress and the states had promised supplies, food, clothes, medicine, even shoes. And some did arrive, but not enough and not nearly fast enough. When wagons did arrive from distant states like Virginia and Maryland, they came into a camp so destitute that soldiers tore the canvas tops off the wagons to use as shelter. Washington himself used a tent made of 3 wagon canvases propped up on 2 chests and a camp table. A few barrels of cornmeal arrived, but after soldiers were given 1 small handful each, the rest of it went bad. No one could find a cook to prepare it. Desperation grew day by day. One afternoon, a detail of soldiers was sent out to forage, to gather food in the countryside. They didn't find much, but they did discover an apple orchard and help themselves to the fruit. When they returned to the camp, however, they were met by officers who told them they would be arrested if they did not immediately hand over their apples. Already, tensions were growing between officers and soldiers. By mid-December, the first snows of winter had fallen, covering the ground in a thick blanket of white. Food was becoming more scarce as temperatures dropped. Washington knew something had to be done. He dispatched 3 officers, including the Baron de Kalb, to nearby Philadelphia to plead with Congress to send supplies. But Congress was in New York now, and most members had little idea of what was happening in Pennsylvania. The following days brought more bitter experiences for hungry soldiers. Wagons sent to the countryside returned empty. Their drivers reported that local farmers preferred selling whatever food they had to the British in Philadelphia, who could pay in gold rather than accept the nearly worthless continental currency. The situation was dire. On December, rations consisted of 1 pint of vinegar and half a pound of dry, sandy flour per person. Some days there was no ration at all. Soldiers were forced to survive on what they could find: roots, berries, the occasional rabbit or squirrel. George Duffield of Connecticut wrote to his sister that hunger and cold were the order of the day, and that the men were reduced to eating berries and small birds which they trapped by the score. They catch rabbits also, and such trash as hogs and dogs vomit up. Even this proved insufficient. With meat being scarce, the soldiers resorted to eating the leather from their cartridge boxes. Another wrote, "We have lived on such trash as half-roasted acorns and other wild fruits. We catch fish in the rivers and such vermin as we can catch and kill. Our officers go out to hunt, but seldom get anything." Still another described how the men ate the acorns and walnuts gathered by the women and children in the area. These accounts of men reduced to eating acorns and leather may seem unbelievable, but they're backed by the journals of the time. Here's one example from the journal of John Mills of the 3rd Maryland Regiment on December 1777. "Captain Armfield and myself got our hands into our cartridge bags and eat the leather scraps, which is our constant diet with a little bit of hog's lard. What little food did arrive at Valley Forge was rarely fit for consumption. Salted beef and pork, when they could be found, were often crawling with maggots." James Thacker, a surgeon with the Connecticut line, recalled seeing huge piles of spoiled meat brought to him by officers. The meat consisted of old beef and pork, which had been so long in the hands of contractors that it was unfit for any purpose but to be thrown to the dogs. Even fresh meat was often in short supply. The men were so starved that they would kill and eat horses. Call Jeremiah Olney wrote to his wife that there was no great plenty of provisions in this quarter. "And those that have been furnished from hence are very indifferent, and we have killed several of our horses. You have no doubt heard of our killing our horses for the want of other meat." There were times when the army seemed to teeter on the edge of mutiny. Joseph Plum Martin, a soldier in the 2nd Massachusetts Regiment, remembered one such incident. "One morning about sunrise, some soldiers going to the common to get a little wood for their company, found a hog in the quarters which they killed and divided amongst themselves. About noon, the officers finding this hog was missing, gave orders that none should leave the camp without leave. Soon after, 4 soldiers were arrested and carried before General Knox on suspicion of stealing the hog. The soldiers declared they knew nothing of the hog. If the officers wanted a hog, they should ask for one, and they would tell where to find one. However, the general found the men guilty and sentenced them to be put in irons. This enraged the whole army, who assembled in a body and demanded the discharge of the soldiers. The officers drew their swords and prepared to defend themselves. Being wearied of the continual disputes between the officers and soldiers, I and many more wished the matter would end here. But had it done, the officers would have been obliged to have fought the whole army." Just then, Colonel Jackson came upon the spot and prevented a bloody contest. After much debate, the soldiers were released from irons, but 2 of them were put in prison. In the course of things, they escaped. One of the few foods the soldiers actually had in abundance was fire cake. A miserable mixture of flour and water baked into a hard, tasteless slab over an open flame. Imagine a brick of concrete, said to have the texture of a brick, and you have pretty much nailed fire cake. So I thought I'd include this recipe for those of you who want to try your own batch of fire cake. First, mix together 1 pint of boiling water and 3 pounds of flour. The dough will be stiff. Roll it out and bake it in a hot oven until it's firm. Then stick it in the fire to harden. That's your fire cake. Bon appetit! But life at Valley Forge wasn't just characterized by hunger and the threat of mutiny. Throughout the winter, work crews could be seen across the frozen landscape building small log huts. Chinked with mud and designed to hold 6 men each. These structures offered better protection from the elements than the tents Washington's soldiers were living in. But even this labor was cursed with misfortune. The heavy snows made digging foundations difficult. And once the huts were built, they proved to be cold, damp, and smoky from poorly ventilated fires. When the chimneys had to be torn down, the roofs collapsed under the weight of the snow. And throughout it all, lice and fleas infested blankets and clothing. Smallpox also returned, claiming victims by the score. Washington ordered inoculation to begin, a process that involved taking small bits of smallpox matter, usually from a person already infected, and inserting them into the arms of willing soldiers. This painful procedure placed the recipient in a controlled situation, deliberately infecting them with the disease in the hopes that they would build up immunity and thus avoid a far worse infection later. It was risky, but it worked, and it saved countless lives. Nevertheless, outbreaks continued to claim men, burning them with fevers and racking their bodies with chills. Men coughed blood into rags. Their heads pounded and their eyeballs felt as though they were on fire. Then their limbs would grow cold and they would shiver uncontrollably. Men died in every hut. The healthiest and strongest fell as easily as the old and weak. Pneumonia, the cruelest of the winter illnesses, killed hundreds. Through it all, the indefatigable Washington walked the camp daily, speaking to soldiers, encouraging them, showing them that their commander endured the same weather and slept in the same valley. But the burden of command weighed heavily on him. His letters to Congress grew sharper, his patience wearing thin. In one, he wrote, "To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes, and submitting without a murmur, is proof of patience beyond parallel." But he knew patience would not last forever. An army could endure hardship for only so long before it broke. One evening, sitting in his tent, Washington looked out over the silent camp. He could hear the wind moaning through the trees and carry the dying embers of the day. But the sounds that chilled him to the bone were not the sounds of the wilderness, but the sounds of his men. There was the low, persistent cough of the sick, the muffled cries of men in pain, and the sharp crack of a musket when another horse had to be shot for food. The air outside the tent was filled with the smell of smoke, wet earth, and sickness. Graves were dug with difficulty in the frozen ground, and as the weeks passed and the death toll rose, some bodies lay in shallow pits, until the earth could be broken in the spring. Men died all around him, and the supplies still did not arrive. For a moment, hope flickered in Washington's chest. Was this going to be the end? Would his dream of freedom die here in the frozen hills of Pennsylvania? He pushed the thought aside, refusing to dwell on it. Instead, he turned back to the biting wind and the unending march of his men toward spring. This was the crucible in which the fate of the revolution would be decided. Not on the battlefield, but here in the quiet. Relentless war against hunger, disease, and despair. By January 1778, Valley Forge was less a camp and more a slow-motion disaster. The cold was constant, hunger was constant. But it was the growing feeling that no one outside the camp cared that pushed the men to the edge. Of the roughly 12,000 soldiers who had marched into Valley Forge, hundreds were already dead and thousands more were too sick to fight. Entire regiments dwindled to a handful of able-bodied men. The official muster rolls for January told the story. 3,000 men unfit for duty due to sickness or lack of clothing. Hundreds absent without leave. Others gone entirely, never to return. Desertion had begun as a trickle, then grew to a steady stream. Some slipped away in the night, heading home to farms and families. Others went into Philadelphia to surrender to the British, choosing a full belly over a tattered cause. Around campfires, the talk sometimes turned dark. Why, some asked, should they freeze and starve while Congress sat warm in its chambers? Why follow officers who could not feed them? Why obey a general who seemed powerless to change their fate? It was dangerous talk, but Washington knew it existed. He had fought long enough to understand that an army could be defeated without a single shot fired. It could dissolve from within. Far from Valley Forge, another threat was growing. One Washington could not fight with muskets or bayonets. Some members of Congress and a few ambitious officers had begun whispering that George Washington was unfit to lead. They blamed him for the defeats of the past year and believed the army would fare better under someone else, perhaps General Horatio Gates, fresh from victory at Saratoga. This movement, known later as the Conway Cabal, was more than idle gossip. Letters were written, alliances formed. One officer, Thomas Conway, had written to Gates. heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad counselors would have ruined it. When word of this reached Washington, his response was icy: a character to lose and a state to forfeit. The inestimable blessings of liberty at stake and a life devoted must be my excuse. Washington understood the fight for independence could be lost not just to British muskets, but to the ambitions of his own countrymen. Through January and February, Washington walked a razor's edge, holding the army together by willpower alone. He met daily with his officers, pressed Congress for supplies, and made personal appeals to state governors. Somehow, the army still stood. But it was thin ice and the slightest crack. Another month without food, another surge of disease, another blow to morale could have sent the revolution crashing into oblivion. The revolution had never been closer to collapse. And yet, in this frozen valley, an unexpected arrival would begin to turn the tide. The first thaw came in early March, and with it, the threat of disease. Mud replaced snow, and the ground, too wet to support fires, turned into a soggy bog. Men slogged through ankle-deep water, stirring up more mud and spreading sickness. By mid-March, nearly 1 soldier in 4 was again unfit for duty. But now there was something else different in the camp. A sign of spring, a sound of hope, the steady clip-clop of a blacksmith's hammer. Forage was being repaired, shoes being made. On March, a supply train finally arrived, bringing food, powder, even some badly needed cash. And as the days grew longer, a new spirit seemed to stir. Morale was not high, but it was no longer rock bottom. Then came the cavalry, not as rescuers, but as replacements. In early April, Baron von Steuben and a few hundred well-trained troops arrived from Rhode Island. Over the next month, they would drill the entire army, teaching them how to shoot, how to maneuver, how to present a proper front to the enemy. More important, they brought with them news of an alliance. France, so long an observer of the war, had formally joined the Patriots, sending out naval and military forces to back the underdog cause. Still, when the French envoy arrived at Valley Forge in May, he found a camp in ruins. Faded tents sagged over latrines. Barefoot men shuffled past piles of rotting garbage. Everywhere was the smell of stale waste and chamber pots. Yet the envoy saw something else as well. Men marched in formation, firing volleys, their rifles gleaming in the sun. They hauled cannons through the mud, their faces grim with purpose. The French realized that in this ragtag camp, he was looking at the makings of an army. As he wrote home, "This is an army, that is to say, a collection of men armed and disciplined, which serves greatly to encourage the Americans." On June 19, 1778, the French alliance was ratified. 2 days later, George Washington stood before his men, announcing, "We now fight for our own freedom and that of the whole human race." From that day forward, the fight to win independence took on a new urgency. On July 24th, Washington's army marched out of Valley Forge. Along the road to Philadelphia, a group of women stood waving. One held up a painted wooden sign reading, "Go, vanquish, return, triumph." Behind them, the camp lay silent, deserted, its fires long cold. The evacuation was complete. So began the American summer offensive. At Monmouth, New Jersey, Washington and his troops beat back the British, inflicting heavy casualties. Then came the long siege of Stony Point, where on July, our 100 Americans led by General Anthony Wayne surprised and overwhelmed a larger force of Hessians. Throughout the South, Patriots won victories over scattered Loyalist militias. And in the West, George Rogers Clark drove the British from Ohio. It was a remarkable turnaround, especially considering the sorry state of the Continental Army just months before. But nowhere was the transformation more evident than in Valley Forge itself. As the winter of 1777 to 78 gave way to spring, the camp slowly emptied out. At first, there were only a few huts standing, then none. Slowly, the trees returned to the hillsides, animals moved back into the fields. In late July, a visitor to the camp wrote, "I cannot help contrasting the present appearance of the place with the miserable condition of the army which lay here last winter. Such a scene of distress and suffering as was exhibited here then is not easily to be imagined or described." As the years passed, fewer and fewer people remembered what had happened at Valley Forge, most accounts coming from those who had been there, and as the decades passed, those stories became legend. But if we look deeper into the past, if we let the stories of those who suffered in the encampment come through their descendants and letters, we find a tale of endurance and grit in the face of unbearable hardship, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. After enduring the brutal winter of 1777, the Continental Army emerged, battered but unbroken, ready to take on the British with renewed vigor. Now watch as the British plan their invasion of America, or check out these other videos instead. By the winter of 1777 to 78, the Continental Army had already been tested and broken in many ways. This was a new kind of war, fought with guerrilla tactics and attrition. The days of storming enemy redoubts and winning decisive battles were over, at least for now. What remained was a struggle for survival until either side broke, and the Continental Army was perilously close to that breaking point. So what happens next will have a profound impact not just on the war, but on America itself. Welcome to my channel. It's me. And in this episode, we're going to look at how George Washington and his army endured the winter at Valley Forge. George Washington was a soldier first, and it showed. While General Charles Lee retreated to warmer quarters and wrote letters of advice, and while General Nathanael Greene ran the Southern Department from South Carolina, Washington stayed put. He refused to stay cloistered in his headquarters. Almost every day, despite the bitter cold, he rode or walked through the camp, speaking to soldiers directly. Some accounts say he paused to help men build their huts or listened quietly as they explained their hardships. He would ask where they came from, or if they had word from home. In the mud and snow, his presence was both a comfort and a reminder. Their commander was enduring the same winter they were. For the half-starved men, seeing their general in the flesh mattered. It proved that the revolution was not being commanded from some warm, distant mansion. It was being led right here, in the same freezing valley. But to lead the army, Washington needed information. And for that, he relied on his network of aides, both official and unofficial. His official aides were well-educated young men, like 24-year-old Tobias Lear, who served as Washington's secretary. They managed his correspondence, delivered messages, and recorded his observations and decisions. Washington also had a number of unofficial aides, like Benjamin Walker, a printer and bookseller from Philadelphia, and James McHenry, a doctor who joined the army in 1776. These men assisted in any way they could, often performing tasks that others were too afraid or too proud to do. In his headquarters, a modest stone house rented from a local Quaker family, Washington wrote constantly. Letters to Congress, to state governors, to merchants, to anyone with the power to send help. He did not soften his words. In one plea to the Continental Congress, he wrote, "Unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place in the Quartermaster's department, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse." And to merchants, John Gibson and Joseph Jones, he wrote, "Your letters of the 20th instant came duly to hand and were most distressing to me. The articles you mention are absolutely necessary for the use of this army, and without which we can neither be of use to ourselves nor formidable to the enemy. I shall only add, therefore, that you endeavor to get them forwarded with the utmost dispatch, and that you consider this business as of the greatest importance. Yours, etc., G. Washington." He also sent a delegation to Philadelphia to demand action. The political situation there was tense. Some delegates bristled at Washington's blunt tone, accusing him of overstepping his authority. Others still quietly supported General Gates as a possible replacement. But Washington was not playing politics. He was fighting for survival. He used his reputation, his allies, and sheer persistence to pressure Congress into reorganizing the supply system. It was slow work, agonizingly slow. But by late winter, some improvements began to appear. Wagons carrying flour and salted meat arrived more regularly. New shipments of blankets and coats trickled into camp. But Washington still had another problem. He wasn't sure he could count on his army to make it through the winter. Morale was low, discipline was lax, and the threat of desertion hung heavy. The problem was not the soldiers themselves, but their officers. Many of them were inexperienced, poorly trained, and unwilling to take orders from men they considered their social inferiors. In fact, hundreds of officers had deserted the army in the previous months. It fell to Washington to convince them to stay. He visited officers in their quarters, spoke to them frankly, appealing to their sense of duty and patriotism. He told them he understood their frustrations, but reminded them of the high stakes. He knew that men would follow a leader they respected, so he chose his words carefully and he delivered on his promises. Slowly, the tide turned. More officers stayed, then began to volunteer for dangerous missions. Desertion dropped to a trickle. Washington had proven that even a professional army could be a political asset. At the same time, the political situation in Philadelphia was becoming increasingly chaotic. As British troops advanced toward the city, Pennsylvania leaders abandoned their capital and fled west, setting up a new government in York. This created tensions with the military. Congress passed laws that conflicted with martial law. Governors refused to provide requested supplies. Washington found himself caught in the middle. Again, he refused to stay safely behind the lines. Instead, he moved his headquarters to a farmhouse near Middle Creek, only a few miles from the British garrison at Reading. It was a dangerous move, but it sent a clear message. He was leading the fight. Washington didn't know it yet, but he was being watched. Back at Valley Forge, Lieutenant Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military veteran, was quietly organizing a drill program. When he arrived in America in 1777, von Steuben was little more than an obscure aide on General Gates's staff. But when Gates lost the Battle of the Cowpens and retreated from Camden, von Steuben found himself in command of a ragtag group of soldiers. Forced to abandon their wounded comrades, he led his men through thickets and swamps until reaching Philadelphia. There, he secured permission to raise a regiment from among the recruits. But before he could set out, General Washington summoned him to Valley Forge to assess the state of the army. Though older and less experienced, von Steuben quickly rose to the challenge. He reorganized the training program, introduced new drills, and insisted on order and precision. At first, his methods were clumsy, but over time, the results were undeniable. The raw recruits transformed into a crack-fighting force. Soon, von Steuben would publish his manual, which established a standardized method of training for the entire Continental Army. Meanwhile, Washington was preparing for the coming spring. He knew that the British would advance again, and he wanted to be ready. He directed his aides to prepare the fortifications around the camp, ordered supplies, inventoried and distributed, and personally inspected the defenses along the Hudson River. Our goal is to bring historical tales like this one to everyone for free, and we've been able to do so thanks to our patrons. For the cost of a couple cups of coffee, you can support our research and writing team each month. We also have some great rewards, including a digital newsletter and access to our private server. Find out more at our website. It's hard to overstate the significance of the winter at Valley Forge. It was a crucible, a test of wills and resources. Washington refused to stay cloistered in his headquarters. Almost every day, despite the bitter cold, he rode or walked through the camp, speaking to soldiers directly. Some accounts say he paused to help men build their huts or listened quietly as they explained their hardships. He would ask where they came from or if they had word from home. In the mud and snow, his presence was both a comfort and a reminder. Their commander was enduring the same winter they were. For the half-starved men, seeing their general in the flesh mattered. It proved that the revolution was not being commanded from some warm, distant mansion. It was being led right here in the same freezing valley. And to lead the army, Washington needed information. And for that, he relied on his network of aides, both official and unofficial. His official aides were well-educated young men, like 24-year-old Tobias Lear, who served as Washington's secretary. They managed his correspondence, delivered messages, and recorded his observations and decisions. Washington also had a number of unofficial aides, like Benjamin Walker, a printer and bookseller from Philadelphia, and James McHenry, a doctor who joined the army in 1776. These men assisted in any way they could, often performing tasks that others were too afraid or too proud to do. In his headquarters, a modest stone house rented from a local Quaker family, Washington wrote constantly. Letters to Congress, to state governors, to merchants, to anyone with the power to send help. Many of them were inexperienced, poorly trained, and unwilling to take orders from men they considered their social inferiors. In fact, hundreds of officers had deserted the army in the previous months. It fell to Washington to convince them to stay. He visited officers in their quarters, spoke to them frankly, appealing to their sense of duty and patriotism. He told them he understood their frustrations, but reminded them of the high stakes. He knew that men would follow a leader they respected, so he chose his words carefully and he delivered on his promises. Slowly, the tide turned. More officers stayed, then began to volunteer for dangerous missions. Desertion dropped to a trickle. Washington had proven that even a professional army could be a political asset. At the same time, the political situation in Philadelphia was becoming increasingly chaotic. As British troops advanced toward the city, Pennsylvania leaders abandoned their capital and fled west, setting up a new government in York. This created tensions with the military. Congress passed laws that conflicted with martial law. Governors refused to provide requested supplies. He reorganized the training program, introduced new drills, and insisted on order and precision. At first, his methods were clumsy, but over time, the results were undeniable. The raw recruits transformed into a crack fighting force. Soon, von Steuben would publish his manual, which established a standardized method of training for the entire Continental Army. Meanwhile, Washington was preparing for the coming spring. He knew that the British would advance again, and he wanted to be ready. Now, as we begin our final episode on the road to Yorktown, I want to ask you to consider making a donation. Our goal is to bring historical tales like this one to everyone for free, and we've been able to do so thanks to our patrons. For the cost of a couple cups of coffee, you can support our research and writing team each month. We also have some great rewards, including a digital newsletter and access to our private server. Find out more at our website. It's hard to overstate the significance of the winter at Valley Forge. It was a crucible, a test of wills and resources. And it's a story made possible by the generosity of our patrons. Until next time, I'm the host. When you think of the American Revolution, your mind may conjure up images of brave revolutionaries like Paul Revere, whose midnight ride famously signaled the onset of the conflict. But what if I told you that this pivotal moment might have been avoided altogether? Welcome to my channel. And today we're exploring what would happen if Paul Revere's midnight ride never occurred. The year is 1775, and tensions between the American colonies and the Kingdom of Great Britain are at a boiling point. The cry of taxation without representation has echoed through the cobblestone streets of Boston and across the New World. The First Continental Congress has convened in Philadelphia to discuss a unified colonial response to the oppressive acts of Parliament, such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. As the delegates deliberate, fiery orators like Samuel Adams and John Hancock stoke the flames of revolution among the populace. Then came the events of April, commonly referred to as the Battles of Lexington and Concord. On an evening much like this one, British regulars under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith prepared for a mission. Their objective: seize colonial military supplies amassed in Concord, a town north of Boston. Unbeknownst to them, word of their movement had reached the ears of Paul Revere, a member of the Sons of Liberty. Accompanied by William Dawes and a few others, Revere set out on horseback, riding from house to house, alerting the countryside that the British were coming. His famous "Listen to my words. The men of Lexington, the British are coming," roused the sleeping town. By the time the regulars arrived at the Old North Bridge in Concord, they were met by a militia force ready to fight. At Concord, the British suffered heavy casualties on their retreat to Boston, harassed all the way by colonial militiamen. News of the confrontation spread like wildfire. Patriot fervor reached a fever pitch, and calls for action echoed throughout the colonies. But what if this fateful ride never occurred? What if the night of April dawned with no warning of the impending conflict? In an alternate timeline, the British regulars, unaware of any organized colonial resistance, rode out to Concord without interference. They seized the supplies, suffering only minor setbacks from the occasional rock-wielding townsperson. Returning to Boston, they reported their success and prepared to defend the city against any colonial reprisal. The Provincial Congress convenes. Leaders like John Hancock and Samuel Adams are quick to condemn the British actions. However, they find themselves in a difficult position. Without hard evidence of planned aggression, they cannot justify armed resistance, at least not yet. Many colonists, enraged by the events in Concord, clamor for immediate retaliation. But cooler heads prevail, urging caution and planning for a more strategic response. The first shots fired at Lexington and Concord now echo only in the annals of an alternate history. No shots were fired that night. No Paul Revere rode to warn the countryside. In this altered timeline, the road to revolution is much longer and fraught with more peril. Now the British, emboldened by their initial success, tighten their grip on the colonies. Additional regiments are dispatched to bolster the forces in Boston, forming a tight ring of redcoats around the city. Curfews are imposed, limiting colonial movement and trade. Tensions simmer as the people of Boston chafe under these restrictions. British officials, fearing unrest, increase surveillance, leading to incidents of police brutality. Desperate to avoid open conflict, the colonial leaders rally support for nonviolent civil disobedience, encouraging boycotts of British goods and promoting greater self-sufficiency among the colonies. Meanwhile, secret committees are formed, laying the groundwork for a more coordinated resistance. Years pass. The cries of taxation without representation now blend with the rumble of discontent over the quartering of British troops in colonial homes. As the situation grows increasingly strained, the Second Continental Congress convenes. Moderates like John Dickinson advocate for reconciliation, while radicals like Samuel Adams and Thomas Jefferson push for independence. The hot debate continues into the summer of 1776. As the atmosphere grows heated, news arrives from the recently established Provincial Congress of a small skirmish near Boston. A group of British soldiers dispatched to seize colonial supplies are driven off by armed militiamen. Though the incident is minor, it echoes the events that never occurred at Lexington and Concord. The time for peaceful coexistence is drawing to a close. Emboldened by the incident and realizing the growing sentiment for independence, the radical wing of the Continental Congress gains the upper hand. On July, they adopted the Declaration of Independence, severing ties with the Crown. The Second Continental Congress now becomes the first Congress of the United States. The Articles of Confederation are drafted and adopted, establishing a loose union of sovereign states. The Revolutionary War is underway. But unlike the timeline we know, there is no well-trained Continental Army. Instead, there are militias led by inexperienced commanders. At the outset, the war goes poorly for the Americans. Lacking the centralized command structure and discipline of the British forces, colonial militias suffer defeats that erode support for the war effort. Even the famed Minutemen, with their legendary marksmanship, struggle against the superior firepower and coordination of the regulars. Undeterred, the Continental Congress presses on. More militias are raised and sent to the front, though their performance is lackluster. It becomes clear that the ragtag bands of rebels are no match for the well-drilled British Army. Desperation grows in the ranks of the revolutionaries. It is during this bleak moment that an enigmatic figure emerges. Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben, a Prussian military officer with experience in the armies of Europe's most renowned tacticians, arrives in Philadelphia. Though lacking formal credentials, von Steuben brings with him a wealth of practical knowledge and unorthodox teaching methods. Initially met with skepticism, he is given a chance when the Continental Congress authorizes the creation of a national army. Von Steuben is placed in charge of training and drilling the recruits. Though his methods are grueling and his demands are high, his approach quickly yields results. The soldiers, many of whom have known little more than hunting and militia tactics, are transformed into a cohesive fighting force. His model company of 100 men becomes a shining example of military precision and discipline. They drill relentlessly in Valley Forge, preparing for the day when they will face the British in open battle. But even as the army improves, the country is not yet ready for war. The Articles of Confederation prove to be a weak foundation for a nation. The central government lacks the power to effectively wage war. Rations are scarce, supplies are disorganized, and finances are in chaos. Despite these challenges, von Steuben's soldiers press on with their training. The sight of these men moving as one, their muskets gleaming, is a beacon of hope in a time of despair. The turning point comes at a small battle in New Jersey. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, finally squares off against the British. The outcome hangs in the balance. But when von Steuben's troops enter the fray, their disciplined formations and well-coordinated maneuvers make the difference. Victory is theirs. The nation rejoices. News of the victory spreads, invigorating the war effort. More men rush to join the army, eager to learn the tactics that have turned the tide of war. Morale soars, and the war becomes one of independence rather than one of attrition. Still, the road to victory is long and fraught with challenges. Throughout the war, von Steuben's influence grows. He helps establish a military academy, ensuring the future of the United States Army. His reforms extend beyond tactics to include logistics and supply, laying the groundwork for a modern military. Yet even as the Continental Army marches toward triumph, the nation grapples with questions of governance. The weaknesses exposed by the war lead to calls for a stronger central authority. The drafting of the United States Constitution ushers in a new era of American governance, one better equipped to handle the challenges of a fledgling nation. As the war concludes, von Steuben's contributions are recognized. He is lauded as the man who built an army from chaos and taught it to win battles against all odds. As for Paul Revere, his name lives on in patriotic songs and stories. But here in this alternate timeline, his midnight ride remains a tale untold. The path to revolution was longer, the battles harder fought. But the outcome, the birth of the United States, is no less assured. So what do you think? Do you believe that without Paul Revere's midnight ride, the American Revolution may have taken a very different path? Or do you think that the wheels of history would have eventually led to the same outcome regardless? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to stay tuned for more thrilling historical tales and alternate history explorations. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you next time. By the early spring of 1778, Valley Forge was still cold, still muddy, and still dangerous. But it was no longer hopeless. The change had been gradual, almost invisible at first. A few more wagons of flour arriving each week. New shipments of muskets and powder. Coats patched, boots repaired, huts made more weatherproof. And every day, von Steuben's drills continued, pounding discipline and unity into the heart of the army. The men who had once shuffled in ragged lines now marched in step. They could load and fire 3 rounds in a minute with precision. The bayonet, once an afterthought, was now a weapon they could use with deadly effectiveness. An observer wrote, Where once there was the appearance of a rabble, there is now the semblance of soldiers, and they take pride in their bearing. The army's transformation was not just physical, it was psychological. For the first time since the campaign began, they believed they could stand toe-to-toe with the British and win. Washington saw the difference and felt it deeply. His letters to Congress shifted from desperate pleas to cautious optimism. He praised von Steuben's work, noting that the men were now better prepared for the field than ever before. He also pressed for continued supply improvements, knowing that discipline alone could not feed an army. The officers, once divided by political rivalries and suspicion, began to pull together. Even those who had quietly doubted Washington's leadership now saw that he had held the army together through the darkest months, and that his choice to bring von Steuben into the fold was paying off. Mutiny talk faded. Desertions slowed. Instead of slipping away in the night, soldiers began re-enlisting, willing to see the fight through. Then, in May 1778, a courier rode into camp with news that electrified the army. France had officially allied itself with the United States. The men cheered. Drums rolled. Cannons thundered in salute. The revolution was no longer a lonely fight. It was now backed by one of the most powerful nations in Europe. This alliance brought more than hope. It meant ships, weapons, and experienced soldiers would soon join the fight. The Continental Army that emerged from Valley Forge was not the same army that had limped into it 6 months before. It was harder, sharper, and more determined than ever. The real test would come soon on the open battlefield. In the opening days of the Revolutionary War, General George Washington's troops fought bravely but with little success. His soldiers were farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers, not professional fighters. And as winter set in across the young nation, it seemed the untrained patriots might simply freeze to death or be captured by the British. But over the long winter of 1777 to 1778, Washington took his ragtag army to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. There, under the watchful eyes of Baron von Steuben, his soldiers transformed themselves. Today, we remember them as an elite fighting force and the birthplace of the United States Army. Valley Forge was a crucible of hardship. Yes, but also a place where ordinary people became extraordinary. It all started when the Continental Congress created a new position, Inspector General, and asked Baron von Steuben to fill it. Von Steuben had experienced drilling troops in both France and America. At first, Washington was unsure about taking on the Baron, not because of his military credentials, but because of his politics. You see, von Steuben was a member of the Society of the Cincinnati, a group of wealthy landowners who wanted an end to slavery and a broader democracy in America. Some fellow generals thought such views made him a threat to the existing social order, and preferred Washington keep him far from the front lines. But Washington had seen firsthand how inexperienced his soldiers were and decided to trust von Steuben. He appointed the Baron Inspector General of the entire Continental Army. The job was a thankless one. Basically, von Steuben was hired to fix the army. His orders were to drill the troops until they were in tip-top shape. That meant 18 hours a day of shouting, sweating, blood, and cursing. The Baron demanded perfection in everything from marching to firing to swordplay. The problem was, his soldiers weren't up to the task. By mid-December, only 2 months into von Steuben's program, an observer wrote, "Our army consists at present of about 2,000 men fit for duty. The officers are as much fatigued and discouraged as the soldiers. In short, our whole military system seems to be tottering to its fall." What was going on? Why couldn't these brave patriots become the kind of fighting force that could win a war? To find out, we traveled to Valley Forge National Historical Park in Pennsylvania to meet historian and park ranger Kevin O'Brien. "You have to understand," said O'Brien, "that these guys aren't used to this level of discipline. I mean, they had been used to being independent farmers and shopkeepers, and now they're being told to get in line and do what they're told, sometimes for 18 hours a day. Not surprisingly, the men hated it, especially when it was 18 hours of cold, muddy misery. One soldier wrote home, "We are obliged to lie in the snow, and oftentimes are so frozen when the sun rises that we can scarce march. Our hands are so froze at night that we cannot put them into our breeches. We are so starved that when the officers eat, we must take up the scraps of meat that fall from the table." But von Steuben knew the only way to build an army was to build character. So he kept pushing the men, even as the temperature dropped and the snow piled up. He also changed the way the army trained. He insisted on smaller units, which allowed his officers to give better, more direct orders. And he forced his soldiers to practice maneuvers over and over again until they were second nature. These new tactics would prove decisive later in the war, but at the time they just added to the men's misery. All they did was make the training last longer. Still, as February turned to March, something interesting happened. The men got used to it. Historian Paul Kenger wrote, "There was nothing automatic about the process by which the Continental Army shed its ineptitude. But if the process had to be willed and crafted by one man, that man was undoubtedly von Steuben." By April, an observer wrote, "The army is forming into battalions, and the appearance is much more like soldiers than before. Every day the work goes on with great harmony between officers and soldiers." That's right. Soldiers who had once hated drill were now doing their best to master it. And that's when Washington really started to notice. He watched his troops run through battle formations and knew he finally had an army capable of beating the British. But while von Steuben had turned raw recruits into a fighting force, he hadn't solved the army's other problems. The men were still hungry and cold. They still lacked weapons and proper clothing. All Washington had to do was read his mail to see that the army's plight was getting worse. In one letter, he wrote, "A soldier's life is hard and difficult in the best of circumstances. In this, ours is 1,000-fold worse, without coats, without blankets, without shoes. We have not even been able to get a sufficient quantity of shoes for the officers." All the while, reports trickled in that the British were advancing, threatening to wipe out the Continental Army once and for all. To stay alive, Washington needed to lead his troops south to warmer weather. And in March, he began the long trek to Valley Forge. Life at Valley Forge was grim, to say the least. Soldiers arrived hungry and sick and found little relief at their new camp. Mud, snow, and rain made life miserable. But the men still had hope. Hope that things would improve, that they would soon defeat the British. That's because as the army struggled through its daily routine, something remarkable was happening. Men were starting to believe in themselves again. Washington understood that the most important part of his job was to keep that belief alive. And as the weeks passed and the drills continued, he knew the army would eventually emerge from Valley Forge, ready to win the war. The transformation was not easy, but it happened. As spring turned to summer, the troops grew stronger and more confident. Desertion, which had been running rampant, slowed dramatically. And in May 1778, an event that would boost morale even further. France formally allied itself with the United States. The alliance was more than a symbolic victory. It brought desperately needed supplies, including weapons, gunpowder, food, and money. With France on their side, the Continental Army was truly on the offensive. Valley Forge had been a long and brutal winter, but it had paid off. On June 19, 1778, Washington proudly wrote to the Marquis de Lafayette, "The scene has undergone a wonderful change. It is now a very pleasant encampment. The huts are good, the fires well regulated. Every officer and soldier has a good coat. There is plenty of provisions for all, and the soldiers are in high spirits." But Washington knew that the true test would come soon. It wouldn't be long before the British came calling. Would the Continental Army, forged in the fires of Valley Forge, stand toe-to-toe with the best troops in the world and win? We'll find out next time. I'm the author of a book about George Washington's crossing of the Delaware River. Thanks for watching this episode, which was produced by me. So today, we're going to talk about the Battle of Monmouth, which took place June of 1778. This is a pretty interesting battle because it shows the difference between how wars are fought in movies versus how they actually fought in real life. See, when most people think of the Revolutionary War, they think of battles like Saratoga and Yorktown, battles where there's a decisive confrontation and one side wins and the other side loses. But the truth of the matter is that most battles during the Revolutionary War weren't like this. Instead, battles usually involved two forces maneuvering around trying to avoid each other so they could get the drop on each other. And even when there was direct engagement, usually it was just a small skirmish. And then the two armies would go back to building their trenches and waiting for the other side to make the next move. Battles like this were frustrating, especially for George Washington, who wanted desperately to win a decisive victory so that he could finally convince the French to come and help out the struggling Continental Army. But winning a decisive victory was harder than he thought. And as he was about to find out, sometimes a defeat could turn into a victory. Let me explain. The year before the Battle of Monmouth, Washington's Continental Army had spent the winter at Valley Forge. It was here that the Continental Army really came together and became a legitimate fighting force. And if you want to know more about that, I encourage you to check out the video on Valley Forge. But the point is that after Valley Forge, Washington's army was much better, but they still needed a victory to prove it. And luckily for them, they got the opportunity in the summer of 1788. In June of 1778, the British decided to abandon Philadelphia and move up to New York City. And this presented Washington with a golden opportunity to deliver a devastating blow to the British. But he knew that he could just rush his troops towards Philadelphia and try to cut off the British in the city. No, he had to be smart about this, and he had to play his cards right or the British might escape. So Washington decided to shadow the British as they marched north, hoping to find a place where he could catch them unawares and deliver a decisive blow. For several weeks, Washington's army followed the British across New Jersey, living off the land and slowly closing in on their quarry. The British, meanwhile, were led by Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, who was determined to reach the safety of New York. As the British army moved north, they were joined by Loyalist refugees who were fleeing the advances of the Continental Army, and they also had a massive supply train to protect, which slowed their rate of march and made them even more vulnerable to attack. All of this gave Washington hope that he would get the chance to deliver the decisive victory he had been looking for. On June, Washington's scouts reported that the British were only 8 miles away, and that night, Washington met with his top officers to discuss the situation. Many of these officers, including Nathaniel Greene and John Sullivan, urged Washington to attack. But others, like Horatio Gates and Benjamin Lincoln, were more cautious and suggested that they continue to follow the British and wait for another opportunity. Ultimately, though, Washington agreed with the more aggressive faction, and he decided to attack the British the following day. The plan was for General Charles Lee to lead a detachment of 4,000 men to attack the British rearguard and hold them while the rest of the army caught up. But as often happened with American generals, Lee got confused and messed up. His attack on the British rearguard was supposed to be a holding action, but it quickly turned into a full-scale assault. And this caught the British completely by surprise and gave them the opportunity to regroup and counterattack. As soon as the British realized what was happening, they deployed their troops and prepared to defend themselves. To make matters worse, Lee was hesitant to commit his troops, and this allowed the British to gradually push the Americans back. But this is where the story takes an interesting turn. You see, in the movies, when a general messes up, the first thing they do is confront them and relieve them of duty. Sometimes they even get executed for losing a battle. But in real life, things don't work like this. More often than not, the general who messed up gets to keep his position and nobody ever mentions that he messed up except in the history books. That's because in real life, someone has to take responsibility for the overall success of the military operation. And in most cases, that person is the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington. So when Charles Lee messed up his attack, it was ultimately up to George Washington to fix the problem, and he did. On June 28, 1778, while Lee's attack was collapsing, Washington was riding forward to join the fight. And when he arrived, he found that many of the soldiers were retreating in disorder, and the situation was quickly getting out of hand. Instead of berating the soldiers or blaming Lee, Washington did what he always did. He got on his horse and rode out to meet the enemy. In the movies, this would probably be a dramatic moment where Washington rallies the troops, cuts down the British officers, and leads the charge to victory. But in reality, it was probably more like this. As Washington approached the troops, he saw that they were disorganized and breaking ranks. And instead of trying to rally them, he turned his horse around and went back to look for Lee. He found Lee arguing with an aide and pulled him aside to ask what was going on. Lee explained that he had done his best, but Washington didn't buy it. He knew that Lee had been afraid to attack the British and had therefore failed to do his job. But rather than punish Lee, Washington did something else. He wrote down a brief statement saying that since Lee was unable to do his duty, he was relieving him of command, and then he sent it back with an aide to be read to the troops. After that, Washington rode back to the front of the line and started organizing a defense. He took command of the right wing, while General Lincoln took command of the left wing, and together they managed to stabilize the situation and prevent a complete disaster. Once the defenses were in place, Washington returned to the village to confer with some of his other officers. During the meeting, he learned that most of Lee's troops were still intact and were positioned behind a stone wall on the right flank. Realizing that this was a good defensive position, Washington decided to keep it. He also ordered that artillery be brought up and positioned so that it could bombard the British positions. Then Washington rode back to the front of the line and waited for the British to make their move. And make their move, they did. Over the next few hours, the British attacked repeatedly, but each time they were beaten back by the American defenders. Throughout the afternoon, the fighting continued, and by the end of it, the British had suffered over 200 casualties. Realizing that he had been defeated, Clinton withdrew his troops during the night and retreated to Freehold. In the end, the Battle of Monmouth was not a decisive victory for the Americans, but it was a clear demonstration that the Continental Army was capable of standing toe-to-toe with the British and coming out on top. As for George Washington, he had proven once again why he was the right man for the job. He didn't blame his officers when they messed up. Instead, he picked up the pieces and fixed the problem. And that's the kind of leadership that wins wars. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a comment below to let me know what I can do to improve.